I'm starting the recording now. I'm sitting here together with Seán Ó, who is co-director of the Center for Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. He works on research on technological trajectories and impacts of AI and other emerging technologies. And we're going to have a conversation here about AI ethics, AI governance, and AI risk. Very glad to have you here, Seán.
It's a pleasure to be invited to join you for this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And just a few words to the audience. We're going to open up for questions and comments towards maybe the final 20 minutes or so of this 60-minute event. And you can, for instance, notify me in the chat about questions you may have during our discussion, and then I'll distribute the word later on. But Seán, let's begin with something relatively hot topic. You have this recent report with several co-authors on tackling threats to informed decision-making in democratic societies, promoting epistemic security in a technologically advanced world. And this connects to what we sometimes call filter bubbles. And there's been a lot of alarm in media in recent years about how this can cause political polarization and so on and so forth. But we've also increasingly heard that these fears are overblown. So does your work help us orient among these different judgments? And does it, can you enlighten us about how we should think of the situation and what to do?
Thanks very much, Olle. So I think something can be overblown while there being a real issue existing at the same time. And the issue of misinformation, fake news, filter bubbles has certainly received an awful lot of attention recently. We started writing about this back in 2018. We released a report called The Malicious Use of AI, where we predicted some developments that actually came to pass during the time we were writing the report, in terms of the possibility of generating convincing fake video, fake image, fake audio that could be used to spread misinformation or to create sort of political chaos of different sorts. And while we were producing that report, the stories around Cambridge Analytica and their potential role in the US and election and the UK process around Brexit came to light. There was an awful lot of panic about this, some of which I think was overblown at the time. The subsequent analyses have indicated that things like the Cambridge Analytica techniques have played a fairly minimal role, if any, in the outcome of these elections. However, I think that that is not to say that these developments won't matter and won't potentially be a real issue in the future. And so I think it is still worth examining them, even if we sort of overreacted in the first instance. And one question that you could ask is, what is really different now? Because it's not as if before the advent of digital media and AI and other techniques that we had a perfect information ecosystem. We have always had propaganda. We've always had newspapers putting a particular slant on the news that people receive. And in some ways, we've had in the past a less rich information environment, in that there were a limited number of newspapers and people learned the information framed in the particular way that those newspapers put it. Whereas now we have in some ways a much, much richer information environment where a skillful and educated person can get access to a wide array of information from a wide range of experts, from a wide range of perspectives. And in principle, you could get a perspective on a particular issue from across the political spectrum, from across experts. So there are some trends that make for, in some ways, a much more robust information environment. On the other hand, there is also the possibility that a person can get a wide range of perspectives, all of which come from a particular angle, that have a particular slant. One can get the impression that a particular viewpoint is much more widely held than it is because of the use of bots on social media, or from information being presented to you as, for example, a user of Facebook that reaffirms your own biases, rather than getting a kind of balanced perspective across the spectrum. And I think there are valid concerns in that direction as well. So we're seeing sort of parallel trends, if you will, that push in different directions and that introduce new challenges. And I think it's as yet unclear how this will play out, but we do need to be, while not getting carried away with the present impact of these, we do need to be thinking about where they may go in future. And I think where it's particularly salient from our perspective is where it comes to engaging with crises situations. So we work on global risks, and for some issues, it really is important that we be able to coordinate in our understanding of an issue and coordinate in our response to an issue. We can't expect to tackle climate change if the majority of our population doesn't believe in climate change and is not willing to take the necessary actions. We can't coordinate around a pandemic response if a majority of our population doesn't believe the pandemic is real, or that masks work, or that vaccines are safe, or so on. So whereas, diverse perspectives are fine in some areas, sometimes we do need to be able to coordinate around true information to be able to respond to a crisis.
Yes. So you started by relating this to the broader report from a couple of years ago on malicious use of artificial intelligence. But I think that in this field, not all the risks necessarily stem from malicious use, but they could come from unintended consequences of, let's say, social media companies wanting to maximize click-through or advertisement income and so on, with no ill intent. Wouldn't that be?
I think that's absolutely right. And it's one of the reasons that some of these risks may be so pervasive, in that, yes, it makes sense if you're a social media company, you want to have people stay on your platform as long as possible. You want people to click through as often as possible, and maybe the more sort of controversial view, or the more kind of eye-catching view, will get the click through more often than the more boring reality. And I think sometimes this is a problem in that there's a saying that, like, the truth is often the simplest thing, but I think for many of the global challenges we face, the truth isn't. So for climate change, you can look out the window and think it's not happening because it's snowing outside, but the reality of the complexity of the global weather system means that the impacts of climate change are very, they manifest in a lot of different ways. And with many of the challenges that we face, the truth is quite a complex matter, whereas a different perspective that is not true, whether it's being deliberately spread as misinformation or accidentally spread by people who believe it to be true, the untrue thing can be a lot simpler and a lot more kind of emotionally or intellectually captivating. And I think this is a problem.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of the kind of problem where you have a debate between, on one hand, a conscientious scientist, and on the other hand, someone who is deliberately out to spread disinformation on some issue. And it can then often be easier for the second guy because he has much more freedom in what to say, whereas the scientist needs to stay close to the actual complicated truth.
That's right. And then there's a second issue, which is that, I mean, so the scientists are not always correct. There are instances in which the initial scientific message that is put out turns out to be the incorrect one. Scientific paradigms do get overturned. So, you know, there was a period when the theory of plate tectonics was ridiculed by scientists, and you were kind of, you know, a crazy person if you put this forward. And of course, now it's the scientific consensus. For a more kind of close to home example, up until around March this year, many of the authorities were saying that masks maybe weren't a good idea, whereas now we know that masks are really important in stopping the spread of COVID. So it's maybe too simplistic to say that there can always be an authority who we should always trust, because sometimes the kind of, you know, the authoritative view turns out to need to be overturned. And as well as that, sometimes there are true perspectives that don't make it into the kind of authoritative message because they are coming from underrepresented or excluded minority groups. So, you know, if I know Black or minority communities aren't involved in sort of decision processes, they may have like true and valid perspectives that aren't making it into the sort of authoritative message. And so we need to be mindful that some, like a lot of the time, the kind of fringe view, if you will, is you know, crazy and untrue. But in some cases, the authority view may be the one that's incorrect, and we don't want to like unfairly exclude those voices that have been traditionally excluded that actually have valid or true perspectives.
So while these questions are all extremely important, it seems that they are still somewhat removed from the main topic of the institute where you're co-director, the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Existential risk can be thought of as the risk for destroying humanity. And these kinds of things doesn't sound quite like what would destroy humanity. So is this work that you do besides the core CSAR work, or are there stronger connections that I don't see here on the surface?
Well, I would regard it as a meta issue that has sort of relevance to our ability to be able to engage with the really big threats. And so earlier on, I linked this to challenges like climate change and challenges like pandemics. I would regard both of those as core to our mission in terms of global risks that threaten our current civilization. I mean, COVID is bad, but it is not the worst pandemic that we could face, not by a long shot. And in order to be able to engage effectively with these, we do need to be able to coordinate across society on both the kind of the truth and the nature of these risks and what is needed to respond to them. And so from that perspective, I do think it's worth not only kind of characterizing the risks themselves in detail. So, you know, what are the chances of 6 degrees and up climate change? What is going to be needed in terms of reduction in carbon emission? But also the meta issue of what do we need as society in order to be able to properly understand, gain kind of collective buy-in to the nature of risks and take the often costly actions that are needed to respond to them. So from that perspective, I do think that there is an important relevance to some of these kinds of issues, even if they're more indirect to the direct nature of the risks.
So with that perspective, it seems like the study of existential risk would then include not just things like asteroid impacts or, let's say, robot apocalypse or nuclear war and so on, but basically the full range of the political issues. I mean, if we think of politics as agreeing on how to create a well-functioning society. It seems like all of these issues are potentially part of this whole framework.
Yes. So, I mean, views will differ on what should be included within this. And obviously, you could take this perspective too far and say that absolutely everything contributes in some way to the stability or instability of our global societies. And if you took that perspective, then you maybe lose focus. But I think that it would be a mistake to limit it simply to like directly talking about how likely it is that an asteroid will hit. And my view certainly is that a much broader range of national and global governance issues need to be taken into account when thinking about how to reduce global risks. So, for example, if we're thinking about a potential pandemic, it's worth thinking about, for example, like what is the worst pandemic we could have? How likely is this? What are the kind of specific measures that you would put in place to counter a pandemic outbreak of this sort? But we also need to take into account the need for a well-functioning public health system, because an effective pandemic response will require like everything from hospital capacity to doctors and nurses, PPE, all these things. So I do think that a broader perspective is needed if you want to go beyond kind of an academic paper about characterizing specific risk to being able to engage effectively and to integrate thinking about global catastrophic risk into a broader framework of responding to these big threats.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about the ongoing pandemic, which I think we should not think about as in itself being an existential threat, right? It's not sufficiently severe, but we don't know what the future has in store for us.
Yes, I agree with that. I certainly don't want to downplay how tragic this situation has been. Well over 1 million people have died, and many more will, and the economic harms have been extremely bad. But it is by no means the worst pandemic that we could have. Scientists have been very concerned for a long time about, for example, the risk of another influenza outbreak. And for example, if avian flu became transmissible between humans, which is a live scientific possibility, that has a much higher mortality rate and is much harder to design vaccines and responses against. So this could be much worse. And the potential for even worse pandemic threats is out there. So one thing that I think from a global catastrophic risk perspective that we need to be doing in the current crisis is learning the lessons from it and using it as an opportunity to be better prepared for the next pandemic outbreaks. And certainly there's an awful lot that we can learn from this situation in terms of the need for fast and effective information sharing between regions and nations, the effectiveness of quarantining and lockdown, and the effectiveness of things like supporting people in staying at home so that they don't catch the disease or spread it. We can learn about vaccine development, we can learn about other responses. We can also learn about the potential for using AI technologies and other technologies to improve our ability to predict and respond to crises. So there are many powerful lessons that I think we can learn from this situation to be optimistic about it in terms of being better prepared for future outbreaks.
Yes, and when it comes to applying AI technology here, I'm reminded of two things. One is that I have actually several colleagues at Chalmers involved in projects amounting to applying AI to make predictions aimed at getting information needed to prioritize healthcare resources with increasing number of COVID patients and so on. And the other thing is this stuff that hit the news recently, that an AI system, I think it's from DeepMind in England, have made breakthroughs in the ability to predict protein folding, which seems like a key element in drug development. So the potential seems to be very good, but of course, all these things have to be applied with ethics. So you have another recent paper in Nature Machine Intelligence with some co-authors on AI in a crisis needing ethics with urgency. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on this ethics with urgency concept?
So sure. There are a number of issues. As you say, people have been coming up with a lot of really exciting and innovative ways of applying AI to basically like every stage of the pandemic prediction and response situation. So for example, right at the beginning, one of the first warnings of the COVID outbreak was from a system called Blue Dot, which like draws in data from everything from like, you know, airline ticket sales through to other forms of media to identify where there might be an outbreak and where it might spread through. People are using AI to speed up identification of drugs that might be repurposed for COVID response. People are using AI to do more kind of granular modeling of disease spread. People are using it to predict logistical needs in hospitals. I'm excited to hear about your colleagues' work at Chalmers. There's also a similar project happening in Cambridge led by Mihaela van der Schaar to predict what the equipment needs and hospital bed needs of particular hospitals will be. And there's a lot more, for example, analyzing disease. When somebody is sick with COVID, being able to use AI to aid in analyzing CT scans of lungs could be very powerful in supporting experts. And there's an awful lot more like this. However, I think it's fair to say that while there's been an awful lot of talk and hype about how powerful technology could be in the COVID response, the applications have been a little bit more limited. And some of this has been due to, well, a lot of the kind of practical elements of applying AI to a new and evolving situation like COVID. It's much easier to apply, for example, particularly machine learning systems if you've got a fairly similar history, which provides you with a lot of data to understand the phenomenon you're looking at. And obviously with COVID, it's quite new. And so we didn't have symptom data and population data on it until earlier this year. And the data sets were smaller. And so it's highlighted that we need to find ways of, for example, sharing data more freely and more effectively, while also safeguarding things like data security and data privacy. And people have very valid concerns about this. And so lots of questions have come up in terms of how should data be stored? How should data be shared? For how long should data be kept? Should there be sunset clauses on how data is kept? How do we make sure that the impacts on different parts of society are taken into account and the concerns of different sectors of society are properly taken into account? And many of these things we governments and research groups have been trying to figure out as they go along, whether it's kind of, you know, regulatory requirements or concerns or broader ethical issues. And we've seen pushback on potential applications of data and AI that could help, but that raise concerns. I think one interesting example is the digital contact tracing app in the United Kingdom, where the first version that was being developed involved centralized collection of data. And one of the reasons for this was that the public health officials in charge felt that it would be very, very valuable to have this centralized data source that machine learning could be applied to give more granular predictions of how bad a disease would become or what the spread might look like, which could be very effective. On the other hand, centralized collection of data does raise more privacy issues, and it raises more concerns about what if this data was accidentally released or people learned more from the data than was originally anticipated, because data can be unpredictable, and that way we can learn more from it than expected. And in the end, I think in part due to these concerns, the UK switched to a more decentralized model where the data wasn't centrally collected, which perhaps had the downside of not providing this resource that machine learning could be applied to, but had the upside of having kind of less concerns from privacy groups. So there have been many of these issues that have come up as we've been exploring how to use AI. And I think that one of the things that we should therefore think about is thinking about ethics not just as sort of a nice thing, but a very practical thing in how to gain public trust, public support, and have kind of robust and reliable technology. And given the speed at which pandemics spread, it would not be ideal to have to try and work all this stuff out on the fly when the next outbreak happens. So my hope is that we can learn from this, and I've been involved with the Global Partnership on AIs and AI and Pandemic Working Group, which is doing some of this thinking. My hope is that we can learn what we need in terms of data sharing and data governance and frameworks, what the ethical issues are, how they manifest, what people should be involved in kind of advising on and participating in the processes around this, so that we can put all these things in place much more quickly in future, and then use AI more effectively to save lives, because saving lives is at the end of the day what this is all about.
So there seems to be a dilemma here where on one hand, the more we can think things through about AI ethics and AI application in a crisis situation, the more we can think things through before the actual crisis, the better positioned are we. But there's probably a limit to how much you can do this, because we don't know beforehand the exact nature of the crisis. I think that the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, what is the correct response depends very sensitively on the exact nature of the pandemic. Take the infection fatality rate, for instance. We still don't have a very accurate number for that, but it's probably somewhere on the order of magnitude 0.7% or something like that, probably a little bit below a percent. And I think that the response to the pandemic would have had to be very, very different if the IFR had been something like 7% or 70% instead. And there are lots of other parameters that you can vary here.
Yes, I think that's right. But I think that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. There will be specific different things about different outbreaks as they occur, but there will also be general issues that I think will hold to a great extent across challenges. So, for example, contact tracing and digital contact tracing apps have been one of the big points of contention during this pandemic. Contact tracing has been used in many, many major outbreaks. It's one of the kind of core techniques. We're working with somebody who has been working on the history of contact tracing in the HIV outbreak. And obviously, there are some specifics of that contact tracing that are different, but it's a core technique. And so some of the data privacy issues that come into play are not so different. Similarly, any respiratory disease that we will have some characteristics, although they may vary a little bit. And so, for example, being able to use deep learning to analyze CT scans will be important, although you'll need to construct individual data sets for these. And so I think there are quite a few things where the like you will still need to vary it a bit and construct new data sets and get new information about the population and so on. But some of the fundamental challenges will be quite similar, and it's easier to adapt something that is close to being suitable than to think about it for the first time.
Right. So would you say that privacy issues in connection with contact tracing, are those issues that have been sorted out satisfactorily, or do we still have to have further discussion on that?
I think that there are still further discussions that need to be had. This is an ongoing situation that looks very different in different contexts. So, for example, the digital contract tracing system that exists in the UK, I think, is pretty robust, and I think there would not need to be privacy concerns about that. However, I would like to see the potential for digital contact tracing systems that allowed more centralized collection of data with a degree of privacy and security that would satisfy all of the civil society groups that work on this, because I think this could be a powerful tool. So I see that as a place where there's an opportunity for improvement. In some other contexts, there have been concerns raised that COVID has effectively allowed a greater level of surveillance to be deployed that people are uncomfortable with, or that may give a greater level of information to governments or to companies than people are necessarily comfortable with, whether it's in facial recognition or in tracking people's movements. And again, this differs across countries. Different countries have taken quite a different approach to it. And obviously in different cultures, there is more acceptance to methods that draw on more individual information on people. In some other societies, this is less acceptable. So I would say that this is a work in progress. What I really think would be very helpful is to have an international gold standard that allowed data sharing to construct kind of larger and more diverse data sets for a lot of the challenges that are involved in disease outbreaks, whether it's sort of virus genome information or symptom information, or like lung CT scans, or like databases of sounds of people's coughs, or the many different things that people are looking into applying AI to use in. And maybe that could be pinned to some of the most rigorous privacy standards. So, you know, the kinds of standards that Europe is developing. And even if, like, my inclination is to think that erring on the side of more rigor and therefore more countries being comfortable in signing up to it would be better, because then we have more robust data sets and are likely to be able to do better science. Because I think a real problem is if our data sets are not big enough and are not diverse enough, and so we end up with kind of prediction systems or diagnosis systems that work very well on, let's say, white male college-aged people, but don't work so well on people from different sex or different ethnicities. And this is a, you know, a well-recognized problem in AI and medical ethics.
So, but you sound at least tentatively optimistic that we can reach global agreement on minimum standards for these sorts of things, despite different cultures putting different emphasis on the rights of the individual versus the good of society and so on.
I think so. I mean, I think that we can achieve like broad international agreement on some things, and then there will be scope for individual countries to do things that perhaps not everybody would agree with, and those need to be culturally and societally informed, and also they need to be informed by the practical situations of countries. So countries that have less robust healthcare systems may need to take more rigorous steps to contain an outbreak, whereas countries that have a lot of surge capacity maybe can take less rigorous steps. But I think there is like scope for at least some kind of minimal standards that would hopefully allow for more effective sharing and kind of central collection of data that could then be a very powerful resource to research groups that are developing tools.
Mm-hmm. So another one of your recently co-authored papers is called Overcoming Barriers to Cross-Cultural Cooperation in AI Ethics and Governance. And from what I understand, you have a couple of co-authors from China, and a couple of you are from the UK/Ireland. So you seem to be, there seems to be a kind of a meta aspect to this paper. But do you want to convey something about what you say in this paper?
Certainly. So my colleagues and I have been spending, for some years now, we've been trying to build links to leading research groups and thinkers in Asia in particular. We've been quite concerned to see the general trend towards, well, particularly tensions between the US and China rising, and this manifesting itself in attitudes towards technology and collaboration on things like AI. We are of the view that AI and digital technology is intrinsically global, and for many of the challenges that we face, and pandemics are one of them, we do need some level of global engagement and cooperation, and we do need to draw on the opportunity to learn from each other, both in terms of research expertise and also kind of societal and ethical challenges. And so we've organized workshops in the last couple of years in the UK, in Beijing, Singapore, Tokyo. And one of the things that's come to light during these workshops is that some of the differences of views or disagreements that are often perceived if you read the media, or even if you read think tank reports about, for example, the difference in attitudes towards privacy, ethics, governance in the West versus the East, they're not entirely accurate in that they are sometimes misrepresented or overblown. So one issue we talked about in the paper is that you sometimes see the perspective in Western media or think tanks that China is really a wild west for data privacy and governance. And certainly the rules and regulations are not the same as in Europe and the West, but we discovered that there are quite a lot more regulations being put in place and more stringent oversight than certainly I was aware of before I engaged in this. And we learned a lot about this by working in collaboration with our Chinese colleagues. And in fact, quite a bit of this work is being influenced in different ways by some of the work and thinking that's happening in the West, whether it's GDPR or the Asilomar principles, or like the EU high-level expert groups work. There's obviously a community of global scholars who are constantly engaging with each other, and so what's happening here does have an influence, and I think what's happening in China should have an influence in the other direction. We also spent some time looking at the ethical and philosophical kind of bases for issues that then get translated into ethics when it comes to AI. So, the role that Confucianism and other philosophies play in Asian ethics, to try to understand, what are the bases for the different cultural perspectives on some of these issues. But yeah, one thing that we wanted to convey was that some things are overblown compared to the reality. So, for example, data privacy issues, there is a lot of concern and sometimes hysteria in the West about things like the Chinese social credit system, which is not nearly as far-reaching or powerful as is sometimes put in the West in practice. Now, perhaps that will change in the future, but at the moment it's much more of a piecemeal process. And so I think having a better understanding of what the practical reality is important there. And we also noticed that sometimes reports and papers from China can be translated in ways that convey a different meaning than would have been originally intended in the original language. And this can be small things. So maybe in the original language, China wants to achieve global leadership in AI and be, one of the world leaders in technology. I mean, every country says this, but then you will see a report in the US that says, China aims to dominate the world. And dominate has a very different connotation than leadership, but it's subtle, but it's important. And this can then result in a response that I think is not as good as if we better understood the different perspectives. And we make some recommendations around this. So we recommend, more high quality translation in both directions of key documents in ethics and governance. We recommend more programs that involve people spending time from Europe and the US, spending time with Chinese universities and research groups and vice versa. We recommend as well doing more to vary the location of the leading AI conferences and the leading AI ethics and governance conferences. Right now, very often these are held in Europe or the US. If you look at where NeurIPS is usually held, or if you look at where the AI Ethics and Society conference is held. But if we vary the location of these conferences, then it becomes much easier for stronger local participation. And this applies not only to Asia, but also places like Africa and South America. So this year had live conferences being going ahead. ICLR would have been held in Ethiopia for the first time. Unfortunately, COVID put a stop to that, but actually this was, I think Tim McAbrew was involved in this because she and others highlighted that it was very, very difficult for scholars outside of Europe and the US to get visas to attend conferences that were held in the US and Canada. And obviously it's very difficult to get a global perspective if a lot of the people from outside of these places can't even participate in the conferences.
But maybe then the pandemic as a side effect gives opportunities to improve global participation and third world participation in these very important discussions.
I hope so. I mean, this is one of the things I hope will change as a result of the pandemic. I don't know about you, but I love the fact that I'm now able to participate in a wider range of meetings at both a much lower climate impact, but also a much lower cost in terms of time and money. It's wonderful for me that I'm able to just sort of log onto my computer and be in a seminar in Chalmers, where otherwise I would have had to take several days off work and travel. Earlier this year, I was privileged to speak at the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence's annual conference. And all that meant was I had to wake up at 5 a.m. instead of having to procure a visa 2 months in advance and to get a very long flight and so on. So I think that an optimistic take on the current situation is that hopefully we will retain some of the greater openness and greater inclusivity that this has offered in terms of making it easier for people from around the world to participate in these conversations.
That's a wonderful vision. Before we let the audience come in with questions, I want to ask you also about the plans that you're involved in launching a master's program on AI ethics and society. Was that the headline?
That's right. And we've just launched it, and we will be closing applications for our first cohort in March and running the first year of it next autumn. And for us, we're relatively new centres in Cambridge, and this is our first foray into masters or kind of like program organized teaching of this sort. The masters is in the first instance aimed at people in business. We've discovered there are a lot of people in business and professional contexts who feel that they need to get a broader understanding of many of the societal and ethical issues around artificial intelligence in society. And this can relate to issues like, how do you know whether your data set is sufficiently robust and sufficiently inclusive? How do you make sure that you're not propagating bias, whether by designing the system wrong or by using the wrong data? Issues like interpretability. How do you make sure that you really understand how your system is working and how it's coming to the results that it's coming to? Issues under the broad heading of responsible innovation. Who needs to have a voice in the decisions around deploying AI, whether it's in a business context or if you're somebody in government in a broader kind of public context? What are the various stages in which you need to involve voices beyond simply those who are developing it and those who are procuring it? We're lucky to have a very interdisciplinary group to draw on in terms of people who give lectures. Some are in machine learning and in data science, others are in philosophy and ethics, others are in law and in social science. So we'll be drawing on all of these to give a broad range of oversight of the issues that people like, for example, the EU high-level expert group and ourselves are thinking about in terms of AI ethics, and also a perspective on what this practically means for people who are using or engaging with AI systems in the real world.
This sounds very exciting, and I'm hoping that you can somehow serve as a role model for similar programs being launched elsewhere, perhaps even Chalmers. That would be perhaps an interesting discussion to have locally. Let's hear if we have any questions from the audience. I think you can just grab the microphone if you have a question. We have lower participation now during the actual seminar since we started posting these seminars on YouTube. So it's not a very crowded room, and I'm not hearing any questions yet. Let me then continue with the geopolitical issues. And if we take a European perspective, sometimes when I talk to people in Europe about this, I hear the idea that we are better in Europe at AI ethics than other parts of the world. So if we want the world to turn out good, we better make sure that Europe is at the forefront of AI development. And that to me sounds a little bit like playing into, or very much like playing into, the AI race dynamic, which I believe can be quite dangerous, and you have even written about this, I think. So there seems to be a kind of dilemma here as well. If we really think that we're good at AI ethics in Europe, we want to influence the world, but we should also hold back in order not to fuel further this race dynamic. Have you thought about this?
Yes. So I think there are sort of two aspects to this sort of consideration. There's one thing to achieve technological leadership, and I'm not sure that Europe is necessarily leading the world there. I think there's a lot of good work happening in Europe, but I think probably the US is still making the fastest progress and biggest breakthroughs, and China is making an awful lot of progress as well. And then there's the kind of ethical and governance side. And I certainly agree that Europe has put a lot of time and effort into thinking about ethical and regulatory issues. And I think for example, the high-level expert group on AI has done excellent work in Europe, and I think the EU white paper this year was very promising. And so I do think there's a lot of ideas that I hope that other parts of the world will draw on and learn from in Europe. But I agree with you that I have discomfort with this idea that Europe is straightforwardly better. I think that there is a lot of really good and deep work happening in places like, well, again, we've been speaking to people in China and Japan and Singapore thinking about these things, and there's a lot of very sophisticated work and thinking happening there. And I worry that if we do want to get kind of global agreement around standards and ethical principles, the wrong way to do it is for Europe to say, we have solved ethics, we know all the right answers, now we will tell you what to do, because this is just, it's not respectful, and it doesn't draw on the deep knowledge and insight and the kind of cultural context of these places. My view is that the best way to achieve global agreement and cooperation around many of these issues is to engage in a process of co-creation, come together as equals, share our insights, share our knowledge, share our different perspectives, and create something as equal partners. I think that this will gain much more kind of international support, and I think may be more robust in the long term. Now, it would be naive to say that we will agree on absolutely everything. I mean, we know that there are, big differences between how Europe and the US and China see things politically, and how many individuals within these places see things. But we can at least establish a baseline of issues that like a lot of people feel are important, and create a starting point for agreement that we can then build on. So, for example, I've been interested to see how much support there's been in China for using AI to support and advance the Sustainable Development Goals and general sustainability. There are some great initiatives being established there, including there's a new international initiative that was established by Beijing that's currently co-chaired by Denise Gall of the United Nations on AI for the SDGs, that really looks at both how we can use AI to address issues like global poverty, climate change, environment, and other societal challenges, while bearing in mind the various ethical issues that come into play. And this seems like something that we can really kind of work together and co-create agreements around. So I would have a lot of optimism for this route, as opposed to a route where Europe tries to solve ethics and then just delivers this to the rest of the world. To me, that nearly feels a bit like some sort of ethical colonialism or something.
Right. I recently had reason to have a look at I think they're called the Beijing AI principles,
Yes.
which, if I understand correctly, is a kind of government-endorsed official document. And to me, this looks a lot like many AI ethics principle documents that we find all over the Western world. Maybe there was a use of the term harmony, as in harmony in society, which I don't think I've seen in any European or American corresponding documents. But that could also be a translation thing, as you mentioned earlier. But overall, I thought that this document is just as good as most of the stuff that I've seen in Europe and the US.
Absolutely. And I believe that one of the authors of the Beijing AI principles was my co-author, Yi Zheng, who is a remarkable person. But if you look at some of his previous publications, before the Beijing AI principles, he performed quite a sophisticated analysis where he analyzed something like 70 AI principles documents from around the world and identified the kind of shared principles and commonalities and the differences. So he embedded his contribution to the Beijing AI principles in a deep analysis of the work that was happening elsewhere in the world. But I think you're right that then he and his Chinese co-authors brought a uniquely Chinese perspective to this. The idea of harmony is a very core one to Confucian philosophy. I mean, my Chinese colleagues would be able to speak more to this, but there are some like powerful philosophical ideas that rarely show up in this form in Western documents, but that I think can bring a lot to the table. And so I think what the Beijing AI principles show is that we are not so far apart. There's a lot that we share, and there's a lot of learning from across cultures that is happening. And in some ways, I feel that right now, it's going too much in one direction. I think it was Andrew Ng at some point who described AI research as a one-way mirror, where Chinese researchers were reading all the papers that were coming out of Europe and the US, but Europe and the US had no idea what was happening in China. And sometimes I worry that there's a similar situation in ethics and governance, where there's a lot of deep analysis happening. And you can see this as well with a book that Tencent released about 2 years ago on AI ethics and governance around the world, where they had very sophisticated chapters on AI in Europe, in the US, analyzing national strategy documents and ethics and policy documents, analyzing the Asilomar principles, the high-level expert group in Europe, and producing a whole book for a Chinese audience about the work that was happening both in China but elsewhere. And I think it's rare to see this level of knowledge in this part of the world of what is happening in with our Asian friends.
Could it be that AI might come to the rescue here through software like Google Translate?
It may very well be, although I think that for the foreseeable, I would still like to see humans involved in these translation processes. And the reason for that is related to my previous point, that subtleties and nuances of language in these kinds of processes are really, really important. And as per the example I gave before, translating leadership into dominance, for example, is like an easy thing to make a slightly wrong translation about, but can end up being interpreted very differently than by the people who read it. So while I hope there's some role for future versions of Google Translate, particularly as machine translation improves, I think that what I'd really like to see is more translations, high quality translations by people who are properly bilingual of the most important ethics and and governance documents in both directions, so that we can really understand what the perspectives of our colleagues in other countries are.
Sounds like an exciting vision. Again, so our hour together is coming to an end. Is there anything particular that I haven't asked about that you would like to bring up?
I don't know. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I guess the only topic that we haven't talked about is, but there's probably not enough time now. When we have spoken previously, we've talked about the link between kind of present day AI ethics issues, like many of those we've talked about today, and some of the longer term AI risk issues that some members of the community have talked about. And the fact that sometimes there's kind of a tension between these. As we've talked about before, my view is that really to be as well prepared for the future as we can be, there should be a portfolio where some people are working on these present day issues and learning the lessons that can then be applied to future challenges, while others are working on specific issues that may emerge as we develop AGI type systems. I would love to see a kind of a research community that had a place for work on both these things and recognize the importance of this entire range of issues.
We're probably heading in that direction. Thank you very much, Seán. It's been a very very pleasant and interesting hour with you, and I'm very glad that you were able to join.
Well, thank you too. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to be a part of it. I managed to combine those words, and I've really enjoyed it. And thank you all for taking an hour of your time to listen to us speak. And thank you, Olle, for being such an excellent conversationalist on these topics. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
You too. Thank you.